Night along a northern lake arrives like a lid, lowering soundless and complete, and on the rim of that silence sits a story that refuses to die. An entire settlement gone between sundown and dawn, hearths, still warm food, half-prepared tools set aside, as if a hand would return in a minute, and never did a human pattern broken so cleanly. It feels less like departure and more like editing by an author who left no notes. The image is simple enough to travel in darkness, and in that simplicity, it acquires the chill of possibility that makes the pulse slow and the ears open wider. The legend names a winter camp on the edge of Canada's barren lands, a scatter of snow houses and tents, along a frozen mouth of water, mapped as Anjukuni Lake, a place where the sky is so large it can be mistaken for intent. And it begins with a lonely traveler cresting a ridge to find a geometry of habitation without inhabitants. A village reduced to a set, a stage with props, and no actors in a world that has no audience except the wind. The way the legend breathes is in the details. A smoldering seal lamp, a stew that nudges the pot's rim, a sled line drooping without dogs, a doorskin moved by air and not by hand. This is not the only version, and that plurality is part of its stamina, because stories with only one doorway grow stale, while those with side entrances keep letting us in from different weather. And so there are versions with open graves, and versions with the dogs found later, versions that borrow lights in the sky from other winters, versions that carry dates like talismans, and versions that refuse to be pinned. And this elastic arithmetic is exactly what makes an absence become a legend, rather than an entry in a forgotten log. The atmosphere fattens on contradiction, which in this case feels like frost drifting into the lungs. To say Vanishing Village is to recruit older hauntings, a colonial colony in the Carolinas that left a single carved word to echo down centuries, a desert hamlet in Rajasthan whose lanes were abandoned overnight according to a tax-haunted rumor, a Brazilian town named in whispers that dissolve upon inspection, a Scottish islet whose keepers were swallowed by weather and work, and all of these form a chorus behind the Arctic tale, their voices thin with distance and full of consonants that scratch the ear just enough to keep it awake. The chorus does not sing harmony. It sings suggestion, which is the preferred music of sleepless rooms. The geography of the vanishing matters, because this is country built in layers of ice and decision, where the land is a library of tracks that wind chooses when it has time, and where a line of footprints can be erased faster than the mind can commit it to memory, if a squall crosses with the right angle at the right hour. And in such a library, absence is easier to write than presence, which means that disappearance is not anomaly, but option. The map here is a mirror turned toward the sky, and the sky is a collaborator with mood swings measured in lightless hours. Those who know winter know that an oil flame has its own language that a lamp's lip tells you if it was pinched shut by a person or choked by a draft, that a bow laid against a wall is a promise, and a trap that a stew cooling under rhyme suggests either hurry or accident. And such delicate forensic work depends on time and attention the legend rarely grants, which is why it thrives on fog more than on footnotes. Each domestic relic becomes a room when the people who set it down refuse to enter the sentence again. The first printed tellings arrive in yellowed newsprint that rides trains and steals coffee stains. Reports boiled down from unrecorded conversations with a trapper whose loneliness becomes a commodity, and somewhere in the compression of remote winter into a city's appetite begins the great migration of small facts into larger drama. The transformation of normal absence into extraordinary vacuum, a process as old as campfire and as modern as wire photo. When story crosses distance, it packs lightly, shedding specifics and acquiring shine. What remains at the core is the human grammar of interruption. A pot that should have been emptied, a parka that should have been lifted, a child's toy whose position suggests it was set down mid-game. A cache whose mouth was left open, as if an answer were about to be taken, and an entire place that feels paused until the surface of that feeling is tapped. and it is discovered that pause has been misread as mercy. In empty places, human sign has a volume you can feel in the ribs. The first breath of conspiracy enters not with aliens or portals, but with the simple calculation that a settlement does not move without warning unless warned by something we are not naming. And there the mind makes lists. Weather, hunger, violence, disease, taboo, a stranger's sudden arrival, a shaman's sudden silence, a border made of ice cracking in the night with a song like law. And each item on the list comes dressed as a clue without showing its credentials. In the cataloging of candidates lies the first pleasure of mystery, the sorting of shadows by shape rather than by proof. And then there is the sky, which in this latitudes loves theatrics. Curtain after curtain of aurora, written with fields the sun throws at the planet, like notes at a student. And sometimes those curtains are complicated by arcs of unfamiliar light meteors, and satellites at angles that feel wrong, and echoes from elsewhere, that paint the underside of clouds in colors borrowed from theory. And the version of the village story that includes lights does so because the sky here is a participant that refuses to be merely backdrop. Under such a ceiling, even packed snow glows like a secret, and secrets thrive when doors are left open on purpose. The last detail, whispered more than written, is always the timeline, because if absence took a day to assemble, the vanishing is logistics. And if absence took an hour to happen, the vanishing is theater. And if absence took minutes, the vanishing is force. And what draws the mind across this frozen lake over and over is the suspicion that this particular emptying felt too neat to be logistics, too quiet to be force, too quick to be anything rehearsed, as if the village rehearsed nothing because the script was delivered late. There, the ice makes its first sound like a throat clearing to announce a longer tale. Between rumor and archive, there is a corridor of paper where dates loosen their belts and testimonies change shoes. And in that corridor, the first name to appear is a trapper who claims to have stepped into a settlement mid-breath and found only the air exhaling a man who told what he saw and perhaps what he felt obligated to shape, because empty places have a way of asking for richer language to justify the cost of attention. His report runs ahead of him by telegram and by tongue, gathering edges that no one would swear to in court, but everyone repeats at tables with good coffee. When the Royal Canadian Constabulary's files are consulted, a different weather prevails, the ink cooler, the sentences underlined with a straight edge, and their officers deny graves disturbed and sky ablaze. Dismiss the tale as a composite of usual movements, seasonal relocations, folded into a single rumor for the sake of drama, a desert made from dunes of anecdote that belong to different years. The official voice sounds certain, because certainty is a habit of uniform, and certainty in print relieves a nation of the obligation to keep looking again at a place it prefers to declare already understood. But distance has its own politics, and the gap between southern desks and northern snow houses can be a mile that never shortens, and in that gap anomalies harden, because those who live near the lake speak of the elastic timing of departure that happens without fuss when caribou change their script, when a wind shifts from cooperative to contemptuous, when a lake's noise changes tone under night. And so while outsiders want a single moment, locals talk about a season's rhythm turning, and the legend floats over both explanations, like ice fog that allows each witness to believe they are seeing the same world. In this uncertain overlap, the story gains stamina rather than loses it. The dogs enter in the cruelest versions, found days later in a ring of hunger, beside a line that had promised work and warmth. And there is debate even in this sadness, because some say they were seen, others say they were never there to be seen, and the difference matters because it points to whether leaving was planned or panicked, whether a hand severed obligations in a hurry or arranged for animals to follow once a route was tested and found good. The animals make the myth ache, and ache is nutrition for stories that want to be remembered by people who have not yet been born. Open graves live in the more Gothic accounts, holes undone by invisible hands, A taboo broken in a climate that cannot afford spiritual debt lightly. And this detail, too, divides into possibilities. Frost heave mimicking interference, scavengers working night shifts, a metaphor misread as event by a listener who needed a stronger word than drift, a ritual relocation of bones no longer safe in a location undermined by thaw. Each explanation is a plank laid across a stream we are afraid to fall into, and the stream is the idea that something larger than logistics paid the village. A visit while the sky could do nothing more than watch. The lake itself is not passive in winter, because the ice sings when temperature falls, screaming and purring popping, like muskets and moaning like an organ. And when a sheet breaks rosette, cracks at midnight, it writes a perimeter on the surface that can turn a sleeping community into islands without boats, and in the morning a new geometry demands a new plan drafted under the pressure of cold air that does not negotiate. A rush to the shore across fresh fissures looks, in retrospect, like a vanish if all you have is a glance from a hill, and memory seldom includes sound faithfully when wind is involved in the making of it. The lights above, borrowed perhaps from other nights, or properly placed in this one, find plausible cause in solar storms that make radios chatter in tongues never assigned to them and turn compasses into slow thinkers, in meteors that arrive unannounced in an unbroken black and shatter briefly into daylight, in auroras that put a boundary around a winter night with curtains. At the exact moment, a decision must be made about staying or going, and even the most rational ear accepts that a sky like that can lean into a conversation as if it had an opinion. Under such influence, timing slows, and timing is where most misfortune resides. There is a ledger of practical reasons for leaving without a note, a thaw weakening the shelf on which cash pits are dug, a rumor of outsiders with guns moving along, a trapline too close for a camp with elders, and children to risk meeting, an illness that turned breath into hazard and distance into medicine, a message passed from a hunter arriving before dawn about a herd moving and an agreement to follow it before the sun could expose the tracks to eyes not meant to use them. None of these alone produces legend, but combined with the atmospheric of an empty stage, they provide enough to build a sensible story that will never be as memorable as the enchanted one. Skeptics hold up documents that deny a crisis ever occurred at the lake, and believers produce newspapers that say it did, and between denial and declaration, the truth has the misfortune of lacking an advocate with the same appetite for letters to the editor. And so the story lives where many do in the space created by a public that prefers the most compelling possibility to the most likely. Yet likeliest does not always comfort, because even probability can be uncaring enough to feel like design when the timing humiliates the prepared. The trapper's role lonely traveler, unwitting herald, unreliable. Narrator survivor of a winter's arithmetic becomes an axis around which the story spins. And around that axis journalists built paragraphs with slant and zeal, and later investigators built counter-paragraphs with truer maps and calmer nouns. And in the accumulation of drafts, the legend gained its patina, the glow of a tale polished by the hands of anyone with an evening to spare, and a taste for the idea that some absences deserve a frame. That frame sits on a mantle in a house the wind keeps trying to lean into, and the house is a country that collects mysteries the way it collects lakes. And lingering over all of this is the sensation that the moment before the vanishing was unremarkable, that there was no drum roll, no warning in the tea leaves, no shiver that moved through the communal habit, only the winter itself and its endless chores. And perhaps that is what terrifies and comforts us in equal measure, that order can pause quietly, that the world can change flavor without changing color first, that exits can be polite even when they are final. It is the politeness of the scene that keeps the story awake at the edge of sleep, asking for one more glance down the shore before the lamp is pinched closed. Evidence, when it arrives, seldom behaves like a knight riding into a courtyard. It enters with mismatched boots, it forgets its hat, it coughs at inconvenient times, and the Anju Kuni file is no exception. filled with careful negations from police, casual affirmations from papers, and a void where photographs and measured statements would have lived had someone known. The tale would be asked to carry weight for a century. The missing negatives and the surplus adjectives share a table here, and both sip at the tea called memory. Researchers of a later generation sent letters to organizations with acronyms to archives with hours shorter than their curiosity, and what returned were photocopies in which the most dramatic lines in old articles bear pencil brackets and question marks, and in which constabulary reports use phrases like "no evidence" that sit in paragraphs otherwise occupied with weather and routine. The absence of a formal investigation is presented as proof by some and as proof of prudence by others, and in this choice of reading, the village disappears a second time into interpretation that prefers its own reflection. One of the most fragile threads concerns maps and mispronunciations, because the lake's name wears variations like scarves, and a place that is sometimes spelled and sometimes guessed becomes hard to pin when the landscape itself is a quilt of water bodies, winked into brilliance by the smallest shift in sun. A rumor can cross two portages and wake up in a different basin, and a headline writer in Montreal or New York could be forgiven for producing precision out of a haze that did not supply it, a forgiveness that does not exonerate, but explains how fiction and fact might have spooned under the same blanket for warmth. Cultural schematics matter too, and it is easy to forget that the word village in this latitude can describe a camp that lifts and sets with the season, a modular architecture in which permanence is not a virtue but a liability, and in which the fastest way to survive is to move before the problem arrives rather than after makes itself undeniable. A winter's community is a verb conjugated by weather, and to those who live it, the disappearance of a settlement is the continuation of a clause. To those who observe it from a distance, it is the end of a sentence, and thus an invitation to imagine a period where a thing, comma, was intended. There is also the refusal of snow to hold confession under wind's cross-examination, the way a yard packed flat by a week of visitors can be unmade in an afternoon by a gust that decides to write its own story in the same space. And in such conditions, footnotes literally drift away, leaving behind the poet's paper, blank and insistent, asking to be filled by anyone who happens by with ink and nerve. Weather is a co-author that demands equal billing and then leaves town during the reading to prove a point about credit. A different category of evidence lives in the biology of dogs and caribou, and those who know either will say that dogs animate quickly when departure is near, and caribou write calendars in their bodies that humans learn to read if they want to be fed. And thus tales that include animals as unresolved puzzles often conflict with practical experience that says a dog line is a telegraph to the future and not an afterthought. When the animal details do not align, the narrative leans further into the sky for companions, which is where lights and sounds present themselves with the eager courtesy of phenomena that know they will always be hired for mystery as supporting roles. Auroral curtains and infrasound from cracking ice create physiological theater in human bodies. Hairs lift breath rates, alter perceptions, sharpen, and then tunnel. And a night walk between houses can begin to feel like an encounter, even when the encounter is only the atmosphere taking off its gloves. Add to this the possibility of a bolide sweeping the firmament on the wrong night in the wrong direction for a mind already fretting about distance and duty, and you have the ingredients for the emotions that settle over a community like frost before language has time to name them. A more terrestrial speculative branch considers taboos and internal frictions, the way a quarrel can metastasize under deprivation into a mass decision. That looks unilateral only after the fact. The way a hunter as failure can restructure a group as root without the failure being permitted as topic at the next lamp, and the way a taboo broken can be managed by absence rather than by confrontation when temperatures enforce efficiency. There is nothing supernatural about a preference for departure over debate when wind threatens and time hardens. And in choosing, a group can appear to vanish without malice or magic. Against these maps and moods, the police memoranda remain, steady dismissing trespassing graves and theologies, in lights pointing toward the plainest reading, that the movement occurred, but that its packaging was an export product tailored for customers far away who considered winter an exotic rather than a workplace. The sternness of this reading can feel like insult when one is in love with wonder, but insult is often a mask for relief for the safety that returns when a story is returned to the shelf marked explainable, even if the explanation was never attempted with the care it deserved. Yet to flatten the story entirely is to betray another truth, that sometimes a place speaks back, and that those who walk into a clearing and feel that something large has very recently passed through it are not fools, and that occasionally timing aligns so abruptly with chance that the effect is indistinguishable from design, even when no mind designed it. The Vanishing Village holds this edge in its palms, offering it to anyone who has walked into a room still warm and wondered where the laughter went, and promising nothing more than the privilege of asking again tomorrow. Near the end of the paper trail, a note from a researcher, decades after the alleged event, quotes a hunter who shrugs at the foreign fascination with a move that to him resembles a change of weather, and the shrug is not contempt but context, a reminder that the scale at which mystery operates is partially our own projection, and that a relocation can be a vanishing to those who do not attend the calendar as closely as they attend the headline. In that shrug, the story both contracts and expands, and the next page remains invitingly blank. Elsewhere on the map, the phenomenon repeats in different costumes, and each costume teaches something about the stagecraft of disappearance, because the Vanishing Village is a phrase that finds echoes in dunes and islands and forests, each with its own acoustics that distort and amplify as needed. In Rajasthan, the lanes of Koldhara are pointed out to travelers as the bones of a community that, legend says, decided in one night to unhook itself from a predatory tax regime and walked into the desert under a curse they left like a flicked light, a story in which memory indicts power, and power retreats into metaphor, because records were not designed to keep sympathy alive. On the Brazilian plateau, an entire town called Horverd slides through rumor like a fish through shade, said to have been abandoned with a chalkboard sentence still on the wall and cooking left on stoves, a tableau so exactly cinematic it practically writes its own score. And yet when investigators arrive with notebooks, they find a kind of negative space where the town should be a confusion of misplaced names and years that implies invention so elegant it became its own kind of cultural artifact. The persistence of this tale proves not that the event occurred, but that the appetite for such a scene remains evergreen and will generate food if denied it. Across the Atlantic, a colony leaves only a single carved word and a sprinkling of theories arranged like stones in a garden, with evidence as sparse as rain in a drought year and debates as vigorous as ever. And part of what keeps that lockbox open is the sheer reach of the ocean that edits evidence by pushing it to the deep. On a rock in the Hebrides, the keepers of light vanish into a storm, and a log that fusses about small chores becomes retroactively ominous, and the mind-hungry will take a phrase about a rope frayed by wind and sew it into a shroud when given half a chance. Reservoirs around the world keep drowning and raising villages, with the seasons revealing churches and streets that step out of silt, like actors when drought calls their names. And while these are not vanishings so much as submergences, they offer a visual grammar for absence and return that bleeds into how we talk about communities that disappear for reasons that are not scheduled. Volcanic flanks collapse and carry hamlets with them into steam, as at lakes that belch gas and smother fields, and in these events, nature writes a firm signature that the Arctic story lacks a signature that comforts, even in tragedy, by relieving us of the obligation to float. If there is a pattern, it is not in the cause, but in the narrative posture. A rune left mid-breath, a sentence interrupted a chorus that misses its cue, A human imprint that looks like an intentional pause, only to resolve into nothing. And it is the pause that produces the itch we call mystery. The more domestic the details, the spoon, the quilt, the lamp, the louder the itch. Because the closer we are to our own gestures, reflected in another's absence, the more we imagine ourselves in the shadow those gestures throw. Conspiracy arrives as a hedge against powerlessness, a way to convert chance into calculus and trauma into intention. And in the case of vanishings, the temptations are familiar. Officials hiding misdeeds, armies moving chess pieces in regions where paperwork prefers not to be honest, researchers extracting stories the way companies extract ore, the Cold War quietly arranging events in shadows that outlast declassification by a generation. In such climates, denying a mystery feels like denying a wound, and admitting one feels like validating pain that never received proper recognition. Which is why the debate over Anjukuni is not simply about facts, but about who gets to define a place and under what weather. Meanwhile, the instruments keep getting better at listening to the planet's subtext. Satellites read the slight subsidence of ground long before a slide becomes a news item. Infrasound arrays record mountain conversations that were previously reserved for goats. Magnetometers sketch disturbances in sheets of data that look like the aurora learn trigonometry. And the more we hear, the more we learn that quiet carries whispers we mistook for silence. Some vanishings shrink when seen in this new spectrum. Others stand unchanged, little knots of narrative that resist untying because what holds them together is less physics than feeling. It would be a mistake to treat the Arctic tale as a simple cousin to these others. It is its own creature, because the environment writes so much of its wardrobe, and this includes the peculiar behavior of lake ice at certain temperatures, and the way a river mouth can become temporarily impassable with a noise like artillery that persuades even the stubborn to change plans quickly. It also includes the way a low sun erases depth perception and invites misunderstanding, a condition under which a line of departing people can literally vanish into light when seen from the wrong angle at the wrong hour. Memory plays its part without asking permission, and a trapper walking alone for days has a brain that begins to edit sensibly, privileging warmth and sleep over fidelity to sequence. And when that brain returns to company, it translates experience into story with the generosity of someone who needs the company to stay while he speaks. Journalists of a certain era, eager for copy that stuck to the hands, helped themselves to the sheen, and archivists of a certain temperament later trimmed the shine back to grain. And in the trimming, a new alloy was created that we call folklore, which carries truths that are not always literal, but are rarely decorative. One winter, decades after the first retelling, a penciled map in a private file draws a dotted line from the lakeshore to a cove protected from wind where a seasonal trail traditionally shifts when ice reports become troublesome, a practical notch in the land that critics of the tale prefer to put forward as explanation. And yet the penciled line's neatness raises its own question. If the route is so obvious to those who live there, why did the trapper not read it and speak of it, unless what he needed, more than any route, was a reason to be listened to in a world where night lasts too long? In that penciled line, both compassion and skepticism find a home, and both will be needed before the thaw. Spring in the barrens does not arrive like a trumpet. It seeps in along edges, ice loosening its shorelines with sounds like books closing, creeks speaking in syllables after months of silence, muskeg softening under boots until every step becomes a question. And it is in such shoulder seasons that archaeologists favor thoughtful walks, because the land's memory rises closer to the surface when the surface is unsure of itself. Tent rings appear as circles of stones where skins once held wind at bay. Cache pits sink in neat dimples where wisdom hid meat from time. Hearths reveal themselves as darker ovals where generations burned decisions into soot. And these small signatures do not sing of vanishing, but of cycles that never asked our headlines for permission. On the shores of lakes like Anjukuni, such signatures are common and instructive, and those who read them can trace the pulse of groups who moved in. Sympathy with animals and weather, staying long enough to name a cove, and not long enough to argue with a river. And to these readers, the idea of a single night making a myth feels like a trick of light thrown by distance. What they also find sometimes are the leftovers of modern appetite. Bottle glass where none should be, a tin of beans, whose label has lost everything except a hint of color, a square nail, a lost scarf. And these artifacts remind us that the 20th century blew through even the quietest corners like a wind of its own design. As for the specifics of the vanishing, the likeliest modern reading is a convergence of ordinary urgency's ice-shifting herd, moving news, arriving in a mind that could not afford leisure presented later as a single stroke by the needs of storytelling. And this reading asks nothing supernatural and offers nothing beyond the modest comfort of probability. Yet probability is a shy helper, and it does not hold the hand of those who prefer tales that explain everything in a single gesture, because such gestures hold us in the night, like blankets we can name, and names are among the oldest forms of heat. There remains the taste of anomalies on the tongue, the little puzzles that a careful policeman dismisses and a careful storyteller keeps, like the arrangement of certain domestic things in a way that feels too neat. The reported smell of smoke, with no ashes where the trapper says they should have been. The ring of silence a traveler says he felt when he expected to hear dogs. A silence that could have been the wind's patchwork of muffling and revealing, or could have been loneliness turned into instrument. These small burrs keep the tale from slipping entirely through the fingers of the suspicious, and perhaps that friction is what keeps it alive. One cannot ignore the ecology of publishing in the era that birthed the modern myth and ecology in which remote winters were exoticized. To keep readers warm, in which an author's name was currency, and a trapper's report served as a coin minted in North and spent in South, in which embellishment was not a sin, but a style, and in which the very idea of verification took a sleigh ride measured in weeks that many editors were not inclined to wait out. In such a milieu, a story about a vanished village was a seed that needed no careful soil to sprout, and sprout it did, into decades of retellings that wore different coats depending on who opened the door. The people whose ancestors read the land before we read the article offer another posture, entirely one that treats the story not as indictment or as entertainment, but as reminder. The communities in this climate move as trees and wind move, that the decision to leave is often kinder than the decision to remain, and fight a condition that is not taking votes, that nothing persists here without both humility and a willingness to translate the world back into roots. Their notion of vanishing is not loss, but change of address without forwarding. And in that phrase lives a wisdom that the rest of us chase with maps instead of with weathered hands. Yet the human urge toward wonder deserves its due, and a good mystery is a vessel big enough to carry both reverence for the pragmatic and affection for the unknown, and the image of that. Night remains potent precisely because it sits at the scene where these attitudes meet. A row of snow houses, lamps breathing quiet that is not yet judgmental, a distant sound from the lake that could be prophecy or merely physics, and then the soft urgency of the movement that leaves a stage set for a performance that will not continue. In that scene, sleep finds material that settles the mind while keeping it curious enough to reopen in the morning. So the Vanishing Village continues to exist as both phenomenon and parable, a meditation on evidence and memory, on how far a sentence can travel before it loses its nouns, on the rooms we carry with us, even when we leave a room behind, and on the tenderness of objects we expect to see used again, and must learn to see as relics instead. The wind smooths the drifts around the tent rings. The sun comes higher by degrees. The water drinks the last of the ice with patience. And somewhere, as always, a small decision is being made to stay, or to go with a speed that would astonish someone reading about it months later. If you stand at the edge of such a lake at dusk, the cold writes its own script across your face, and the light tints the snow in colors that photographers cannot be entirely honest about. And it becomes clear that an overnight can be a long time and a short time, depending on whether you are inside or outside the story, and that the difference between normal and legend is an angle that might be as slender as the tilt of a lamp's flame. That angle is where the mind rests before sleep, imagining footsteps that continue just beyond the lip of hearing, carrying tomorrow into a direction we will not learn until it is already yesterday. We keep telling it because the heart likes rooms that empty politely, because the mind likes puzzles with edges missing, because the eye likes horizons that complicate rather than clarify. And because in a world where everything is collected and tagged, it is a quiet relief to encounter a gap that refuses cataloging without becoming malicious. The village may have simply moved at the right time and been seen at the wrong angle, and yet the legend gives us permission to ask better questions of place and of ourselves when we enter rooms that seem recently vacated by weather rather than by will. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.